This happened back in 2017. I was in my mid-30s, and up until then, life had been going pretty well. Then it all seemed to fall apart within a couple of months. The company I'd worked for almost 10 years downsized, and I was one of the people who got laid off. About 3 weeks later, my girlfriend of 6 years decided she didn't see a future with me anymore. I don't blame her. I wasn't exactly easy to be around after losing my job. But having both of those things happen so close together really messed with me. I spent about a month sitting around my apartment doing absolutely nothing. One morning, I finally realized I couldn't keep living like that. So I threw my backpacking gear in my truck and drove to Shenandoah National Park. I didn't have much of a plan other than spending a couple weeks on the trails and clearing my head. My dad took me hunting every fall growing up, so I was comfortable in the woods. I wasn't some survival expert, but I knew how to read a map, filter water, and stay out of trouble. Backpacking had always been the one thing that helped me slow my mind down. Then everything changed on the 8th night. I'd already crawled into my tent and zipped everything shut. My headlamp was off, and I was just lying there listening to the woods the way I usually did before falling asleep. Out of nowhere, I heard someone say,
"Hello?"
It wasn't loud. It sounded like a man speaking in a normal voice from somewhere out in the trees. I froze. The first thing I thought was that another backpacker had gotten turned around after dark. It happens. I actually reached for the zipper, thinking I should answer him. Before I could move, the voice came again.
"Hello, I know you can hear me."
Something about the way he said it made me stop. He didn't sound scared. He didn't sound lost. He sounded patient, like he already knew someone was there and was just waiting for them to answer. I stayed completely still. After about 30 seconds, he spoke again.
"Why won't you answer me?"
That was enough for me. I wasn't about to start talking to some random person wandering around in the woods after midnight. I just lay there, hoping he'd eventually leave. After another minute or so, everything went quiet. The next morning, I walked around my campsite expecting to find footprints or maybe another trail nearby that I'd somehow missed. Nothing. I convinced myself it had probably been another backpacker passing through and kept hiking. The following night, I made camp a few miles farther down the trail. Around midnight, almost to the minute, I heard it again.
"Hey."
I immediately recognized the voice. It was the same guy.
"I found you again."
That sentence made my stomach drop. I grabbed my flashlight but didn't turn it on. Then he laughed. Not a crazy laugh, just a quiet little chuckle.
"I know you're in there."
This time I answered. I yelled, "Who are you?" There was a pause before he replied.
"I've just been out here for a while.
Another pause.
I wanted somebody to talk to."
I don't know why, but that answer bothered me more than if he'd threatened me. Nobody hikes around the woods after midnight looking for conversation. I reached over and grabbed the handgun I kept beside my sleeping bag. I told him I was armed and that if he came any closer, I wasn't going to hesitate. He didn't sound offended. He almost sounded disappointed.
"I wasn't going to hurt you."
I finally worked up the nerve to unzip the tent. The second I touched the zipper, silence. I opened it as fast as I could, jumped out with my flashlight, and lit up the trees. Nothing. No footsteps. No flashlight. No movement. The woods were completely empty. I barely slept after that. The next morning, I seriously thought about ending the trip. Instead, I convinced myself I was overreacting. Whoever it was had never actually threatened me. He was just weird. That turned out to be one of the worst decisions I've ever made. The third night, I made camp earlier than usual because I wanted enough daylight to look around before settling in. I checked the area carefully. There weren't any fresh footprints that I could see. No signs that anyone else had been camping nearby. Once it got dark, I zipped myself into the tent and tried to stay awake. At exactly the point where I started feeling tired, I heard him again.
I liked your fire tonight.
My heart sank. There was no way he could have known I'd had a fire unless he'd been watching my campsite. I didn't answer.
I watched you reading.
I looked over at the book lying beside my sleeping bag.
I almost came over earlier.
I grabbed my pistol. "You need to leave," I yelled. He ignored me completely.
You look less sad than when you got here.
That one hit me harder than anything else he'd said. I'd never spoken to him. I'd never told anyone why I was there, which meant he'd been watching me long before I'd ever heard his voice. I rushed to unzip the tent again. The zipper had barely moved 6 inches before everything stopped. No breathing, no voice, nothing. I searched around camp for almost 20 minutes. Again, nobody. The fourth night was when I stopped believing this was some harmless guy messing with me. He didn't say hello anymore. He just started talking.
You've been thinking about leaving. I wish you wouldn't.
I didn't answer.
I don't get many visitors.
He sounded irritated, like I was disappointing him somehow. When I told him to get lost, he sighed.
You always hide in there.
A few seconds later, he said something I'll never forget.
You never come outside until I stop talking.
I don't know why that scared me so much, but it did. He knew exactly what I was doing every night. He knew I waited for silence before opening the tent. That meant he wasn't just standing in one place talking. He was watching me, watching the tent, watching my reactions. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I packed everything. I didn't care that I still had almost a week left. I was done. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it back to my truck before dark. I still had several miles to go, and hiking unfamiliar trails at night wasn't a risk I wanted to take. So I had no choice but to camp one last time. I hated every second of setting up that tent. As soon as I zipped it closed, I waited. It didn't take long.
I knew you weren't going to leave.
His voice sounded much closer than before. Close enough that I could have sworn he was standing just outside the tent.
I waited all day.
I pulled my pistol out immediately. "You need to get away from my campsite," I shouted. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he quietly said,
I wish you'd stop threatening me. I've never threatened you.
He was right. That realization made me feel sick. He hadn't threatened me, not once. But somehow that made the situation even worse. Because normal people don't spend 5 nights standing outside a stranger's tent trying to get them to come outside. I grabbed the zipper again. Before I could open it, his voice suddenly changed. It wasn't louder, it was sharper, almost annoyed.
Don't.
I froze. Then he asked the question that still wakes me up sometimes.
Why do you always want to look at me?
I don't remember making the decision. I just remember ripping the tent open anyway. I stepped outside with my flashlight in one hand and my pistol in the other. The clearing was empty. Completely empty. Then, from somewhere behind me, maybe 30 or 40 yards deeper into the woods, I heard him one last time. His voice sounded farther away than it had a second earlier. Almost impossible.
You weren't supposed to do that.
I didn't wait around to figure out what he meant. I threw my gear into my backpack as fast as I could, left half of it behind, and started hiking in the dark. I didn't stop until I reached the parking area a little after sunrise. I've spent plenty of nights in the woods since then, but I don't backpack alone anymore. Every now and then, usually when I'm lying in bed and the house is quiet, I'll think about that last thing he said. Like I'd broken some kind of rule that only he knew existed. I was 29 when this happened, and looking back, I definitely overestimated how prepared I was. I'd done plenty of day hikes before and even a few overnight camping trips, but I'd never attempted a long backpacking trip by myself. I'd been watching YouTube videos for months, buying gear whenever I had some extra money, and convincing myself I was ready for the Appalachian Trail. My plan wasn't to thru hike it or anything crazy. I just wanted to spend 5 or 6 days on one section of the trail and unplug for a while. The first couple of days went better than I expected. I settled into a routine pretty quickly. I'd start hiking early, stop whenever I found a good place to eat lunch, and then, a few hours before sunset, I'd look for a spot off the trail where I could set up my tent. I didn't like camping right beside the trail since people passed through at all hours, so I'd usually walk a couple hundred yards into the woods before making camp. That turned out to be the mistake that caused everything else. On my third morning, I packed up like I normally did and started walking back toward where I thought the trail was. I never found it. At first, I wasn't worried. I figured I'd just drifted a little farther from camp than I realized. I picked a direction and kept walking. An hour later, I still hadn't found the trail. I pulled out my map and compass, but the truth is I wasn't nearly as confident using them as I'd convinced myself I was. I knew the basics, but standing in the middle of endless woods where every direction looked exactly the same was a completely different story. I kept hiking. By early afternoon, I knew I was genuinely lost. I remember sitting on a fallen log eating a granola bar and trying to convince myself not to panic. Everybody says the worst thing you can do when you're lost is panic. But that's a lot easier said than done when you realize you've been walking for hours without seeing a trail marker, another hiker, or anything that looks familiar. I figured if I just kept moving in one direction long enough, I'd eventually hit either the trail or a road. Instead, the woods just kept going. Late that afternoon, the sky turned dark. At first, I thought the sun was just getting low, but then I heard thunder off in the distance. Within 20 minutes, it started pouring. Not the kind of rain where you throw on a jacket and keep hiking. The kind where you can't see very far in front of you and everything around you is soaked in minutes. I found a big tree and stood under it for a while, hoping it'd let up. It didn't. If anything, it got worse. By then, it was starting to get dark too. I remember thinking I was probably going to end up throwing my tent up in the rain, which I really didn't want to do. Then I saw the cabin. It was maybe 50 yards through the trees. It looked old, really old. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and half the windows were boarded over. I honestly felt relieved. I walked up onto the porch and knocked. Nothing. I knocked again a little louder. Still nothing. There wasn't a vehicle outside. No lights, no smoke coming from the chimney. It looked abandoned. I tried the doorknob. It wasn't locked. I remember hesitating for a second because I knew it wasn't my place to just walk into somebody's house, but standing outside wasn't exactly an option anymore. I stepped inside and called out a couple times. No answer. The place smelled old and damp. There was a wood stove in the corner, an old table, and a staircase leading upstairs. It looked like nobody had lived there in years. I figured I'd leave first thing in the morning if someone actually showed up. Upstairs, there was one bedroom with an old mattress sitting on a metal bed frame. It wasn't comfortable, but it beat sleeping outside in the storm. I laid my sleeping bag on top of it and fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up sometime during the night. I still don't know what woke me. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe I heard something without realizing it. The room was almost completely dark except for a little moonlight coming through one of the broken windows. At first, everything looked normal. Then I noticed someone standing in the doorway. It was a woman. She wasn't moving. She was just standing at the top of the stairs looking directly at me. It took a second for my eyes to adjust, and that's when I noticed the knife. She was holding it down by her side. I didn't move. I don't even think I breathed. My brain was trying to figure out if I was still dreaming. Then she screamed. I've never heard anybody scream like that before. It wasn't a yell. It was this long, piercing scream that echoed through the whole cabin. The second it stopped, she turned around and calmly walked back downstairs. I just sat there, frozen. I kept expecting to hear footsteps coming back up. They never did. I don't know how long I stayed awake after that. Hours, probably. I was too scared to even stand up. Every scenario that went through my head ended badly. Finally, the sun started coming up. I remember thinking I should grab my stuff and leave right then. Before I could, I heard the front door downstairs open. A man's voice filled the cabin. He sounded frustrated.
I didn't find anything.
A few seconds later, he said something else I couldn't quite make out. Then I heard the woman whispering to him. I couldn't understand a single word. The conversation stopped. Then the man yelled,
Who's up there? What the hell are you doing in my house?
At that point, I figured staying quiet probably wasn't going to help me. I called back that I'd gotten caught in the storm, gotten lost from the trail, and only stayed because I thought the place was abandoned. There was a long silence. Then his voice completely changed.
Oh, well, why didn't you just say something? I'll get you back on that trail right after breakfast.
I remember thinking how strange that was. One second he sounded furious. The next he sounded like the nicest guy in the world. It didn't feel genuine. I slowly walked downstairs with my backpack on. The woman was standing at the stove cooking something in a cast iron pan. She looked at me for maybe a second before going back to what she was doing. The man smiled and reached his hand out. He introduced himself. Then he nodded toward the woman.
Sorry about my wife. She had a pretty bad accident a few years ago.
She never acknowledged what he said. She just kept cooking. The smell coming from the pan was off. I don't really know how else to describe it. It smelled like meat, but not anything I'd ever cooked before. When she finally set it on the table, I honestly couldn't tell what it was. The pieces were grayish and uneven. The man smiled.
Go ahead. Eat.
I thanked him but told him I really just wanted to get back to the trail. He looked disappointed.
You should eat first.
The room suddenly felt very small. Nobody was threatening me. Nobody had pulled a weapon. But every instinct I had was telling me not to sit down. The woman hadn't said a single word since I'd come downstairs. She was just staring at me. The man was still smiling, but it didn't reach his eyes. He asked if anyone knew where I was hiking, if I was meeting anybody, if people would be expecting me soon. I answered as vaguely as I could. He just nodded. Then he pushed the plate a little closer to me.
It's getting cold.
I don't know what finally made me do it. Maybe it was the way they were both looking at me. Maybe it was the smell coming off that plate. Whatever it was, something in my head just said, leave. I mumbled something about grabbing the rest of my gear. Instead, I turned, yanked the front door open, and took off running. I didn't look back until I was well into the trees. Both of them were standing on the porch. Neither one moved. Neither one yelled. They just watched me. The man wasn't smiling anymore. The woman still had that same blank look on her face. I kept expecting them to chase me. They never did. I ran until I physically couldn't anymore. A couple hours later, somehow, I found the trail again. I don't know if I'd just gotten lucky or if I'd been closer than I thought the whole time. Not long after that, I ran into two other backpackers heading the opposite direction. I must have looked completely exhausted because one of them immediately asked if I was all right. I ended up telling them everything. I know it probably sounded insane, but they let me hike with them for the rest of the day until we reached a shelter. I thought about reporting the cabin, but what was I really going to say? Two weird people let me spend the night during a storm, cooked me breakfast, and offered to help me find the trail. It wasn't enough. Maybe they were just incredibly strange. Maybe I completely misread the situation. I honestly hope that's the case. But if you ask me whether I think sitting down at that table would have been a mistake, yeah, I do. And I have absolutely no interest in ever finding out what was on that plate. I've always preferred hiking by myself. It's peaceful, and honestly, I'm not much of a people person. I wasn't doing anything extreme, just a 3-night trip on a trail I'd read good things about. Everything was going fine until the second afternoon. A thick fog started rolling in around lunchtime. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal, but within an hour, I could barely see 50 feet in front of me. I stopped a couple times to make sure I was still following the trail, but eventually I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a long time. I figured I had wandered onto some game trail without realizing it. I wasn't too worried at first. I had a map, a compass, and enough food for another couple days if I needed it. But after spending the next 4 or 5 hours trying to relocate the trail, I finally admitted to myself that I was completely lost. By then, it was getting late. I really didn't want to pitch my tent in the middle of thick fog without knowing where I was, so I just kept walking, hoping I'd find something. Right before dark, I noticed a tall silhouette sticking up through the trees. At first, I thought it was a cell tower or something. As I got closer, I realized it was an old fire lookout. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. The paint was peeling off the sides, a couple windows were cracked, and the stairs creaked with every step I took going up. Honestly, I was just happy to have a roof over my head. The door wasn't locked. Inside was exactly what you'd expect. There was an old cot against one wall, a desk covered in dust, a couple empty shelves, and an old radio sitting on a table in the corner. I assumed it didn't even work. The place looked like nobody had been up there in a very long time. I ate dinner, rolled my sleeping bag out on the floor, and fell asleep faster than I expected. I woke up to this loud burst of static. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. Then I realized it was coming from the radio. It had somehow turned itself on. I sat there for a few seconds listening to nothing but static before a man's voice finally came through.
Station 12, you awake?
The signal was terrible. I honestly thought maybe another lookout tower was trying to reach somebody and didn't realize this place had been abandoned. I walked over and picked up the microphone. I don't know who you're trying to reach, but I'm just a backpacker. There was a long pause. Then the guy said,
So, somebody's up there?
Something about the way he said it immediately made me uncomfortable. I told him I got lost in the fog and was just staying the night. Another pause. Then he asked,
You're alone?
Yeah.
You've got a blue backpack?
I looked over at my pack, leaning against the wall. Yeah.
You hiked in this afternoon?
It wasn't a question. I didn't answer. Then he said,
You should close those curtains.
I remember just staring at the radio. There were curtains over the windows, but I'd left most of them open because it was already dark outside. I walked over to the nearest window and looked out. Nothing. Just fog. I couldn't even see the bottom of the tower anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and checked every window. There wasn't a single light anywhere. No other tower. No campsite. No flashlight. Nothing. I got back on the radio. Where are you? No answer. Just static. I asked again. Nothing. After about another minute, I got annoyed more than anything. I shut the radio off, crawled back into my sleeping bag, and eventually fell asleep again. The next time I woke up, it wasn't because of a noise. Something just felt off. I don't really know how to explain it. You ever wake up in the middle of the night and instantly feel like something isn't right? That's exactly how it felt. I opened my eyes and saw light moving across the ceiling. At first I was confused. Then I realized somebody was shining a flashlight through one of the windows. The beam was moving slowly around the room. It passed over the desk, the shelves, the floor. Then it stopped, right on me. The second I sat up, the light disappeared. I jumped to my feet and ran to the nearest window. I caught a glimpse of somebody down below, just a dark silhouette disappearing into the fog with a flashlight in one hand. They weren't running. They were just walking quickly until the fog swallowed them. I checked every window after that. Nothing. I thought about leaving right then, but there was no chance I was climbing down that tower in the middle of the night with fog that thick. I stayed awake until sunrise. As soon as it started getting light outside, the fog slowly began lifting. For the first time since the afternoon before, I could actually see farther than a few yards. While I was looking around from the tower, I noticed a thin column of smoke maybe a mile or two away. My first thought was, honestly, relief. Somebody else was out there. Whether it was another backpacker or a camper, at least it was another person. I climbed down, packed my gear, and headed toward the smoke. It took me close to an hour to get there. When I finally reached it, it was just another backpacker sitting beside a small campfire making coffee. I don't think I've ever been happier to see another human being. I asked him if he knew how to get back to the trail. He laughed and said I wasn't nearly as far off it as I probably thought. While we were walking back, I ended up telling him everything that happened. The radio, the questions, the flashlight outside the tower. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he looked back in the direction we'd come from and said, "I've heard people talk about that old lookout before." I asked him what he meant. He just shrugged. Nothing specific. "I just know I wouldn't stay there." That was it. He didn't elaborate, and honestly, I didn't press him. About another hour later, we were back on the trail. I thanked him, and we went our separate ways. I still think about the night every now and then. Maybe the guy on the radio really was in another lookout somewhere. Maybe the person with the flashlight was just another hiker who got curious after seeing someone spending the night up there. Maybe they weren't connected at all. I don't know. What I do know is that whoever was on that radio knew I was inside that tower before I ever said a word. And that's the part I've never been able to come up with an explanation for. Getting lost taught me to be a lot more careful. But if I ever find myself choosing between spending another night in an abandoned fire lookout or sleeping in the rain, I'll take the rain every single time.